guys. I'm here in Jackson Hole at the Wyoming Game and Fish office, the regional office. They have offices all over the state, Wyoming Game and Fish do. And in these buildings, this is where hunters come to buy permits and stuff like that. But they also have scientists who work in these buildings. They have their own library in this building, a research library with wildlife and science data and so forth. And these scientists do a lot to manage the health of the herds in the state. They make sure that the groups of people that are interested in animals, whether they're hunters or conservationists or environmentalists or just citizens that live where wildlife tend to come into the private lands a lot, they work to help keep a balance of people's interests and to make sure the wildlife are taken care of, but also the people are taken care of too, and so keep a balance there. But they do a lot of research studies, these scientists and biologists, and they're people just like you and me that might have grown up with an interest in animals or developed it later on, and then they got into these cool jobs. So we'll talk to some of them and learn more about what they do and what these regional offices do. So hope you enjoy this field trip. Hey guys, I'm back here at the Game and Fish office here in Jackson Hole for the state of Wyoming, and I'm here to talk to, what was your name again?
Susan Patla.
Susan Patla, who's a scientist here in this office, and we're going to talk to her same way we do with Ben Wise about what they do and how they interact with wildlife and the cool things they do for our state as scientists. So, good to meet you.
Hello.
So tell me a little bit about how you got into this career coming out of school, which these kids are in right now.
Okay. Well, I've had a very varied career, actually. A lot of people come to Wyoming Game and Fish, and that's their first and last job. They stay for 30 years. But I got a degree in Michigan, and my degree was in biology and biological anthropology. But then I actually worked in oceanography for 5 years and then worked as an experimental winemaker in Napa Valley. But during the time I was in oceanography, I fell in love with birds because I got to go to some very remote places in the world, and I got to see incredible birds, especially out at sea, that very few people get to see. So while I was doing other jobs, I kept increasing my birding skills and bird watching a lot. And my goal was to get a job someday as a bird biologist. So I was fortunate that my husband worked as a merchant marine fellow, and we could live anywhere in the world, it turned out. So we left California and moved to Wyoming back in 1987. And I immediately volunteered for the Forest Service and found out at that time few wildlife biologists really knew birds very well. There was more traditional where they knew waterfowl maybe, but most studied ungulates, moose, deer, and elk. So I was a needed commodity at the time. So I ended up working on a bald eagle project and then working on a goshawk project, and that's a forest hawk. So I went back to graduate school, and I'd been out of school 20 years at that point, but I knew I had to get a degree in wildlife, or actually ecology. So I went back to school in Idaho State, and did a long study on the northern goshawk, which is a very secretive forest hawk that lives in forests. And after that, I started to get part-time jobs looking for a full-time job, and I ended up, there was an opening in Wyoming Game and Fish Department in Jackson for a non-game biologist. It's one of the only jobs that begins with a negative word, non-game. And there's only 4 of us full-time in the state at this point. So I was very fortunate to be the right person at the right time for the job.
So what do you do here as a non-game biologist?
In the state of Wyoming, we have over 400 species of birds and over 100 species of mammals, and only maybe 20% of those are species that are hunted or fished. So we're actually responsible for all the other wildlife in the state. And how we do that, we have a plan where we look at all the species and decide which ones are most at risk. So our job is to really keep tabs on species that are at risk and make sure that they don't become endangered or listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act. So we monitor these species to understand population trend, and then we also come up with partnerships and plans and ways to improve the status of species that are declining.
What is an example of a bird that the kids might know here in the state that you are concerned about?
Well, I still work on some species that are no longer considered endangered, but bald eagle is a bird that one of my first jobs was on bald eagle, and then here we continue to monitor the species. It was taken off the endangered species list in 2007, but it's still a protected species. So I keep track of all the nests in western Wyoming, and I do that through wildlife flights. So I hire a pilot and fly and see how many of the nests are occupied every year and how many young they have. So now I monitor over 80 nests of bald eagles. But back in the 70s, we only knew of maybe 12 or 14 nests. So it's been a spectacular success story for that species.
So I know the kids are probably thinking, is it an airplane?
Yes.
How do you see into a nest from an airplane and count everything?
Well, it's challenging. You have to fly low and slow, and you have to be with a pilot who's very experienced in those kind of flights. So I'll be maybe 100 feet off the ground, more or less, and it's easy early in the year when the leaves are off the cottonwood trees, and that's where most of the eagles nest. So you can see into the nest very clearly. And eagles, you can see actually, when you're in an airplane, sometimes you can see that white head on a nest from, a half a mile away even.
Yeah.
So but you have to know how to position the plane to get a good view into the nest.
Are you just looking out the window, or do you have a camera or binoculars or anything?
It's hard to use binoculars in an airplane, so you're looking out the window, and the pilots look too, of course, and then I do have cameras where I take a lot of pictures. So that species, the other one we've done a lot of work on is a trumpeter swan, and that's one of our rarest species. We only had about 60 living year-round in the Jackson area, but we started to use captive raised birds to expand the population into the Green River. And so now we've more than doubled our population. We have over 200 birds, and we produce a lot more young now. So that's a species that never was endangered, but still people have worried about it for a long time. Back in the early 1900s, they thought it was completely eliminated. In fact, they thought it was probably extinct at that point, but there were a few left in Yellowstone Park. So there's been a long history of work with that species. And
is there one up on the wall up here? Is that a trumpeter?
Yes, that is one. So that's a species I also monitor mainly through flights, flying over their nests, and they're a big white bird, so thank goodness, very easy to see.
Where do they nest?
They need shallow water wetlands, which is one of the rarest habitat types here. So, and they will use the same nest site for decades. And even if a pair dies off, another pair will move right in if it's good habitat. So we have in the Jackson area maybe about 15 different places they nest. In Green River now maybe over 30 places, but they're very specific what works for them.
Do they stay here year-round?
They do, but then in the winter we have hundreds more coming down from the interior Canada. So this Wyoming is their Florida basically. So we have a lot more swans in the winter than the summer. So people wonder why we worry about swans, but it's because we have so few that actually stay here year-round. The other ones turn around, and this time of year in March they head back toward the north.
What other birds do you study?
In the past, we've done a lot of work on peregrine falcon, but recently we've gotten money, and that's one thing I do. I write a lot of grants to get money, and we compete for federal dollars within the state, but then also from other, nonprofit organizations. So the great gray owl is a wonderful owl, and Wyoming is its most southern range. So we've been doing a lot of work on that species recently with the Teton Raptor Center, which is a nonprofit here in town. And recent technology has really made our work easier because we can use satellite transmitters if a bird is large enough to carry one, so we can start to understand what the bird is doing year round, because we can get locations downloaded to our computers. And so we know what they're doing during the nesting season and the winter as well.
How do you put one of those devices on a bird?
It depends on the bird. So an owl or other hawks will actually use a backpack harness, and it's with leather thongs that go over the shoulder. You can't interfere with the wing motion at all. And then it's sewn, it's attached on the chest. So it's on the back. And with great gray owls, it's kind of a problem because they have so many feathers. You have to put it on. You can't use solar transmitters. Some of them have little solar panels on them, so you don't have to put many, heavy batteries in them. Mm-hmm. But owls with too many feathers, that doesn't work. It just covers the transmitter up. Mm. And we often use a little bit of cotton thread in the final stitching, which will, decay over time. So even if we don't recapture the birds within 2 years, they usually shed their radios.
It falls off.
Yes. But long-billed curlew, which is a shorebird, which is an amazing bird if you see it in the grasslands. It has a bill almost as long as its body, a long decurved bill. And those we put a little fanny pack on, and that works very well. It's just one strap around toward their lower back. And we had one bird that's been carrying one for 4 years, and it's still giving us data. And she goes all the way to Mexico, south of Mazatlan, Mexico, to winter.
Really? And then comes back here?
Back to the same spot, to the National Elk Refuge.
Wearing a fanny pack.
Yes.
How do you spell that, curlew?
That's Curlew.
Okay.
Long-billed curlew.
That way the kids can Google it and look at pictures.
Yes, and they only nest in the Intermountain West, so our study is part of a regional study to see where these birds nest and where they migrate to in the wintertime. And birds like this, they're actually only in Wyoming 3 or 4 months, so most of their life is spent somewhere else.
Interesting. Do you have any stories or memories, experiences with your job that stick out in your mind as something really interesting the kids might like to hear?
I do a lot of different types of surveys, so not just from airplanes, and I spend a lot of time by myself, in the forests and mountains of Wyoming. So you never know quite what you'll encounter. So I've run into a few bears. I see wolves once in a while. So one has to be very alert when they're working by themselves in Wyoming. And the worst thing is not getting stuck,
Yeah, in the mud or something.
Yes.
You mentioned airplanes. How else do you get around? Do you ride horses much or anything like that?
I don't ride horses, but I hike extensively and ski extensively also in the winter. I did in the past, and some snowshoe. But we have our own trucks, which is one of the benefits of the job. A lot of agencies, federal agencies, you don't have your own vehicle, so you work for the state. And I put on, in the summertime, I can put over 2,000 miles in 1 month on my truck.
Just driving around.
Yes.
What might these kids want to know about your job or anything? Can you think of anything they might want to know here?
Well, a lot of times kids want to know what it takes to get a job like this. And I would say you need a degree in science. You need to get a degree in wildlife. And Wyoming has one of the best schools in the country, but other adjacent states do too. So if you want to do this kind of work, you know, get a good degree. And then to be a biologist, you really need a master's degree too. But one of the best things you can do, even as a student, is to go in the local offices and see if you might volunteer for a day or two. You know, if you, like I got my job basically because when I moved to Wyoming, I volunteered first thing with the Forest Service. So you can get a lot of experience that way. And also, if you're interested in wildlife, like for myself, it was my passion for bird watching that really led to this career. So if you have a passion for something, don't be afraid, even if your relatives think you're strange. No one in my family had ever done anything like this before.
Yeah. Something new and different.
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. We appreciate your time.
Okay, well, good luck for everyone.
Thank you. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed this trip. I thought it was interesting. So there's all kinds of cool jobs out there, and anything you can dream up, you can probably do. If you love birds, like she said, get a degree in science and pursue your dreams. So thanks for coming. See ya.